This is part 2 of the Indian Evidence Act. This is the third video recording. The notes are prepared from PRR in a very simple language. My name is Vivek Nahadia and my contact number is 880-1919-249. You can WhatsApp me for any doubts. Let us start. Questions from 1 to 4 of PRR. I have already recorded the video in the part 1 and part 2. As this is the third part of the video, I am dealing with questions 5 to question number 22. Question number 5. How far judgments are relevant under Indian Evidence Act? Generally, judgments given by courts in one case are irrelevant in other cases. This means that once a court gives a judgment in one case, it cannot be the basis as evidence. It cannot be used as evidence in some other case. This is the general rule. But there are a few exceptions to it. What are the exceptions? A previous judgment becomes relevant when there is a prohibition on a fresh trial of a case which has been previously decided by a court. What is the prohibition? What is the general rule? A case already decided is irrelevant in another case. But there is an exception. Exception means what? The case already decided can be used as an evidence in other case. What are the exceptions? The first exception is in the previous judgment. A previous judgment becomes relevant when it becomes relevant when there is a prohibition on the new case which has been previously decided. If there is a prohibition on the new case, then the judgment of the previous case becomes relevant. Second point, any judgment which operates as res judicata is allowed as evidence. Res judicata means when a court gives final judgment on merits, other courts are not allowed to take up a fresh suit on the same matter. What is res judicata? Suppose a court has given a judgment. The other courts are not allowed to take up the same issue. Instead, they can use the judgment given by the previous court as an evidence. Third exception. Thus, in a criminal case, when the court convicts an accused, subsequently he cannot be punished for the same offense. This is called double jeopardy. A criminal cannot be punished for the same offense again and again, and this is obvious. This is called double jeopardy. What is judgments in rem? Judgments can be divided into two categories: judgments in rem and judgments in personam. We will take up the first category, judgments in rem. For our easy understanding, we are mentioning it as JIR. Judgments in rem are judgments affecting rights or status of a person. These judgments affect the rights or status of a person. Example, matrimonial status. Such judgment is not only relevant against a person who is a party to the judgment, but relevant in all cases against all persons whenever a question regarding this marital status arises. What is judgment in rem? These are the judgments which affect the rights or status. Example, matrimonial status. So such judgment is relevant in another case also where the issue is similar. Now we will take up the second point, that is judgments in personam. Judgments in personam are narrower in scope as they bind only the parties to the judgment and their representatives. They are irrelevant in other cases. Example, judgments related to contracts or tortious acts. Judgments in personam are narrower. Judgments in rem are applicable to the parties and even strangers to the party, strangers to the case. That is, judgments in rem are applicable not only to the parties who are in the case, they are even applicable to the strangers. But judgments in personam are narrower in scope and they are applicable only and only to the parties to the case. Example of judgments in personam are judgments related to contracts. A contract is between two persons. So such contracts, business contracts or any contract, are related only to those two parties only. The strangers are not bound by it. Thus, judgments in rem are thus even relevant to strangers. Now, what is court of probate jurisdiction? Probate we have already studied. It is related to will. When a competent authority certifies a will, it becomes a probate. Court of probate jurisdiction is the jurisdiction of a court, is the authority of a court. It is the power of the court to decide genuineness of will and has authority to grant letters of probate. Court of probate jurisdiction does not mean there are separate courts. It means a court which has an authority of probate jurisdiction. It is like a power given to a court. And the power is to issue letters of probate. Now we will talk about admiralty jurisdiction. This is the authority of court. Again, it is the power given to a court. These are not separate courts. It is the authority given to a court to decide cases relating to ship, cargo, etc. Insolvency jurisdiction. Authority of a court to decide cases where a person is bankrupt, insolvent person, a person who is bankrupt, whose liabilities exceed the assets, is called an insolvent person. Matrimonial jurisdiction. Authority of court to decide matters relating to validity of marriage, etc. What are the issues that come up relating to marriage are decided by the courts who have authority of matrimonial jurisdiction. What is the general rule? A stranger is not affected by judgment to which he is not a party. There is a case or suit between A and B. C is not a party of the suit or litigation. So C is not affected by the judgment between A and B. Thus, a stranger C is not affected by the judgment between A and B to which he is not a party. But there is an exception to this. What is the general rule? A stranger to a case is not applicable. A stranger to a case is not affected by the judgment to which he is not a party. But there is an exception. In few cases where even if I am a stranger, I am affected by the judgment given in that case. What are the exceptions? Judgments on matters of public nature are applicable to all. Suppose there is an issue between A and B regarding some public matter, and that judgment will be applicable to C, D, E, F or any other person, because this is an issue of public matter, public nature. Any matter which has its impact on a considerable section of population can be treated as a matter of public nature. How do we are saying that judgments which are on matters of public nature are applicable to everybody, even if a person is a stranger to the party, a stranger to the case. So first we should understand what is public nature. So we are defining in the second point what is public nature. Public nature means any matter which has its impact on a considerable means not very less, a little bit of, at least little bit of population should be there. Considerable section of population is considered as public nature, is considered as a matter of public nature. Example, judgment on tax, customs, etc. Tax is applicable to everybody. So whatever the judgment a court gives between two persons on tax matter, it is applicable to the third person, that is even a stranger. Example, A is sued by B. B is the landlord for trespassing his land. What is the judgment given? Suit dismissed on the ground that public have right of passage over the land. Subsequent suit, same land is there but some other party is there. Earlier judgment will still be relevant. Judgment of the court can be questioned if it is obtained by fraud. Generally the court judgment we can't question, but if it is obtained by fraud, then it can be questioned. The next question is relevancy of experts' evidence. But before that, let me summarize question number 5. How far judgments are relevant under Indian Evidence Act? General rule is what? Judgment already given cannot be relevant in other case. But there is an exception. What is the exception? The new judgment, that is the new case. The new case is prohibited on a fresh trial. Then the judgment which is already given can be used. Judgment which operates as res judicata, which means when a court gives judgment on merits, other courts have to accept it. Third one is double jeopardy. A criminal cannot be punished again and again for the same crime. Now we are talking about judgments in rem and judgments in personam. We are saying judgments are divided into two categories: judgments in rem and judgments in personam. Judgments in rem means what? The judgments which affect the rights and status of a person. Such judgments are not only applicable to the person, they are even applicable to a stranger. Next, we are talking about judgments in personam. These are in narrower scope and they are applicable only to the parties to the case. Example, business contracts. Now we are discussing different types of jurisdiction of a court. First one, probate jurisdiction. Court has the authority to grant letters of probate. Admiralty jurisdiction. Courts have authority to decide cases relating to ships and cargo. Insolvency jurisdiction. Courts have authority to decide cases where a person is declared as bankrupt. Matrimonial jurisdiction. Authority of the court to take up the cases relating to marriages. General rule is that a stranger is not affected by the judgment given by the court. There is an exception to it. Matters which are of public nature are applicable to all. So what is a matter of public nature? Judgment affecting a considerable portion of population is treated as a matter of public nature. Example, judgments on tax. Now we'll discuss about relevancy of expert's evidence. This is a very, very important question in exam. It will be asked for about 15 marks. Expert evidence. Opinion of those persons who are specially skilled in the fields of handwriting, science, art, and foreign law. Handwriting, science, art, and foreign law are allowed as evidence. Opinion of the experts who are experts in the fields of handwriting, science, art, and foreign law. Those opinions, those expert opinions are allowed as evidence. Now we'll talk about what is the meaning of expert. Expert is a person who has acquired special knowledge and skill in the fields like science, art, profession or trade or handwriting, etc. And this special skill in the field is obtained by his experience or by observing or doing a detailed study of those fields. Two conditions to accept expert's opinion as evidence. When can we accept expert's opinion as evidence? If these two conditions are satisfied. You can see and here. And means both the conditions should be satisfied. First condition. Subject matter of the case requires expert evidence. Expert evidence cannot be taken up for any case. The subject matter of the case is such that an expert opinion will be necessary for that case. Then only expert opinion must be taken. So the first condition is that subject matter of the case requires expert evidence. And witness is really an expert. By telling that you need an expert opinion, you cannot take evidence from any other person. The witness also should be an expert person. So there are two conditions. First, subject matter requires expert evidence, and the second, witness is actually an expert. In following matters, expert evidence is required. So what are the matters in which expert evidence is required? For this, there is a memory technique. FAR handwriting. F stands for foreign law. We will talk about the other points in the subsequent slides. First, foreign law. Any law which is not in force in India, Indian courts will not be able to interpret foreign law, and thus expert's opinion is required. Obviously. Thus, any law which is a foreign law, it is obvious that our judges won't have knowledge of that foreign law. So that's why an expert who has knowledge, in detailed knowledge of that foreign law is consulted and his opinion is taken as an evidence. The next field is science and art. Any matters which are beyond the capacity of a common man to understand. For such matters, expert's opinion is taken as evidence. F stands for foreign law, A stands for art, science and art, R stands for relationship. A person who has knowledge of the relationship of the persons can give it as an evidence. Suppose your friend has knowledge of the relationship between you and your wife. So your friend can come and give evidence. A person who has knowledge of the relationship can give evidence. So he becomes an expert. FAR handwriting. F stands for foreign law, A stands for art, science and art, R stands for relationship, and then handwriting. The fourth field is handwriting identification. A person who has seen the person's handwriting or received documents written by that person, opinion of such person is relevant, obviously, because he has seen the person's handwriting or he has some documents which are written by that person. So obviously his opinion is definitely relevant. Court can even compare handwriting in dispute with handwriting provided. Court can even compare handwriting in dispute with handwriting proved to be that of person. First we are saying a person who has seen or has documents of that person, opinion of that person is relevant. The second, court can itself compare the handwriting of that person by taking the document in question and compare it with the document which is accepted or proved to be in that person's handwriting. Simple, don't complicate it. It's simple that if you want to see, generally what we do, if you want to see whether it belongs to that person's handwriting or not, we take up the two papers and compare whether both the signatures or both the handwritings are matching. That's what court does. Court can order any person to write in order to compare it. The court can even ask the person to write so that it can compare. What is the evidentiary value of the expert evidence? This means that what is the value of the expert evidence? Can the court rely completely on it, or the court shouldn't rely, or the court should moderately rely? What is it? What is the value of such evidence? Evidentiary value is a very important point. It will come in almost all the questions in the Indian Evidence Act. So what is the evidentiary value of experts' evidence? Act is silent about it. There is a possibility of error, falsehood, or expert acting with bias. Bias means expert is not being fair. Expert is a human being. There are several drawbacks, like he might be corrupted. So there is a possibility that his opinion might be changed by giving him bribe or anything. So we can't rely completely on an expert's opinion. There is a possibility of error. Error means he is not intending to give a wrong statement, but by mistake he gives a wrong statement. Falsehood, it is bad on his part. He knows that he is writing something wrong, but he is writing it. Or expert acting with bias. Thus, these drawbacks reduce the value of expert opinion. Thus, expert opinion is not a conclusive evidence. Conclusive evidence means what? Once a conclusive evidence is given, there is no doubt to the court that the fact is incorrect. It will be accepted as it is. Conclusive, the word itself says conclusive. Uske beyond no discussion. So expert's opinion is not a conclusive evidence. To summarize, relevancy of expert's evidence, we are telling who is an expert. A person is an expert who has special knowledge in the fields of science, art, profession, trade, handwriting, etc. Two conditions are required to be fulfilled for an expert's opinion to be taken as an evidence. What are the two conditions? The subject matter should require expert's opinion, and witness is actually an expert. In what matters can we take expert's opinion? The memory technique is FAR handwriting. F stands for foreign law. If the issue is related to the foreign law, our judges won't have idea about it. So the case is referred to the experts and their opinion is taken as evidence. Then science and art, any matter which is not easily understandable by a common man can be referred to an expert. Relationship, a person who knows the relationship, your friend knows your relationship between you and your wife, so his opinion can be taken as an expert's opinion. Handwriting identification, a person has seen you write, or he has some documents written by you, his opinion is obviously relevant, or court can compare both the documents. What is the value of the expert's opinion? Expert is also a human being, so there is a possibility that his opinion might be biased or incorrect. So expert's opinion is not a conclusive evidence. That's it. Now we'll move on to the next question, question number 7. Give an account of leading questions. This is a very important point. What is the meaning of leading questions? It is a question which suggests answer to the witness. It is a type of questioning in which the form of the question suggests the answer. The question itself suggests the answer. It is not a normal question. You'll understand it. Leading question. Were you at Casey's bar on the night of July 15th? This is a leading question. You'll understand this when we compare it with a non-leading question. Non-leading question. Where were you on the night of July 15th? This is a normal question that we ask anybody. And leading question which is asked in the court is, were you at Casey's bar? The lawyer is specifying the place and specifying the night, the date, everything, and the witness just has to say yes or no. In the non-leading question, he has to answer the name of the place and all. So that is the basic point of differentiating between a leading question and a non-leading question. In the court of law, generally leading questions are asked specifically to cross-examine the witnesses, because when a witness comes to the court and is brought against suppose two lawyers are there, A and B. B brings a witness C to support his point. C comes to the court and gives his opinion. Then A, the counterparty who is fighting against lawyer B, A can cross-examine C by using leading question. These leading questions are used to shock the witness and take out the truth from them. I'll explain you in detail about this as we proceed. Leading questions can be used in cross-examinations, as I said. They are not allowed in re-examination unless permission of the court is obtained. What is re-examination? We'll get to know it later. As of now, I can say that in our example, B had brought the witness C and A is the counterpart or opposite lawyer against B. So when A examines the witness of B, that is C, it is called cross-examination. And when B himself examines the witness C again, it is called re-examination. So basically there are 3 stages in examination of witnesses. That question will come later, but even then I'll just tell in gist. B brings C as a witness in court. This is called examination in chief. Once this is done, A can examine C. This is called cross-examination. And again, B can examine C. This is called re-examination. So they are not allowed in re-examination unless permission of court is obtained. It can even be allowed when the parties do not object it and even the court permits it. So leading questions cannot be allowed in re-examination, and that is obvious. When you yourself have got the witness, it is not required for you to use the style of leading question. So they are not allowed unless you are taking the permission from the court. Leading questions can even be allowed when the parties do not object it and even the court permits it. But example we take it in re-examination. What is the general rule? In re-examination, leading questions cannot be asked unless you take the permission from the court. But there is an exception. How this point is an exception? Why it is an exception? Because it says that when you take the permission of the court and the other party, that is party A, lawyer A, does not object to it, then lawyer B can use leading question in his re-examination. So it can be, leading question can be allowed when the parties do not object it and even the court permits it. As the time taken is very huge, I am not summarizing the questions and I am directly proceeding. Who is a hostile witness and what is the value of hostile witnesses evidence? Generally, hostile witness means, example, B has brought witness C. Witness C comes to the court, but generally what happens, C should give an opinion or say something or give an evidence which is against lawyer A, or C should give evidence in support of lawyer B, because lawyer B himself has got witness C. When I am asking you to prove me, it is normal that when you go to the court, you will support me. But when you're going to the court, you're turning against me and supporting my opposite party. In this case, in our example, B has brought witness C to support his case, to support B. But when C went to the court, instead of supporting B, C is supporting A. Such witnesses are called hostile witnesses, who change their opinion once they come to the court. So generally, when a witness is called, he speaks in support of the party. Witness means C. When a witness C is called, he speaks in support of the party B who calls him. But sometimes the witness may speak against the party who has called B. Such person C is called hostile witness. In such a case, the party who has called him, Mr. B, to be a witness can cross-examine him. Normally, the power of cross-examination comes to the opposite party. But now as the opinion of C has changed and the opinion of C has become against Mr. B, opinion of C has become against Mr. P, power of cross-examination comes to Mr. B because C is acting against him. In such a case, the party who has called him, Mr. B, to be a witness can cross-examine him. B can cross-examine C now with questions to bring out the truth. And he can use leading questions now. In India, it is court's discretion to decide whether a party should be permitted to cross-examine the witness whom he has called. Next question. What is 30 years old document and explain how it is proved? This is a previous examination question and it is taken as a ancient document. Yeah, it is also called ancient document. A document which is 30 years old, if produced and court is satisfied, then it is presumed that the signature, attestation and writing which appear in the document are of the person whose signature it bears. So suppose you find a document which is 30 years old. Nobody knows what has happened in 30 years. It is very difficult to object a document which is 30 years old. So whatever is written, in whosever handwriting it is written, is taken and it is accepted. And that is obvious. See, such presumption is necessary because it is impossible to prove the handwriting of a person after 30 years. Who knows how my handwriting will be after 30 years? So when a lawyer brings a document which is 30 years old to the court presumes that it is correct and it is in that person's handwriting. Now what are the requirements? It must be 30 years old document and means both the conditions should be satisfied. And it must be produced from a proper custody. It is not that you are getting the document from any other person. The document should be produced from a proper custody and it must be 30 years old. Both the conditions must be satisfied to make it as an ancient document, and then the court will accept it as if it is in that person's own handwriting. Now we'll move on to the next question, that is hearsay evidence and value of it. As I told you earlier, evidentiary value of every evidence is very important in this entire act. Hearsay evidence. The word itself will tell you the meaning of it. Hear and say. First you hear, then you say. Evidence of facts given by a party not by his personal knowledge, but he got to know about it through some other person. Example is what? A has murdered B. C has seen the murder. C went and told about this murder to Mr. D. D has heard the facts. Now D goes to the court and gives his opinion and says that yes, even I have heard that A has murdered B. So what is he doing now? First he has heard the facts from C, and now he is saying it to the court. Hear and say. D has heard the facts from C and is saying it to the court. So evidence of facts given by a party not by his personal knowledge. D has not seen the crime, but he got to know about it through some other person, C. D got to know it from C. The witness does not get this evidence by his own senses, that is hearing or seeing, but he acquires it through some other source. D himself has not seen the crime with his own senses, that is eyes or heard or anything. He acquired the evidence through some other source, that is C. Thus it can even be called as an indirect evidence. It is not a direct evidence. What is the general rule? Evidence of a witness must be direct. Evidence of a witness must be direct, and thus hearsay evidence is not at all valid. What is the guarantee that this is true? So evidence must be direct. This is general rule. So hearsay evidence is invalid. But there are exceptions. In few cases, hearsay evidence is also valid. What are those exceptions? Res gestae. Res gestae is a very important concept, and it is asked repeatedly in previous examinations. I'll explain res gestae in detail in the following slides. Res gestae, statement which is part of some transaction in dispute before court, can be admitted as evidence. Example, in our previous example, A has murdered B. C has seen the murder. Suppose there is another fact that before the murder, A and B were quarreling with each other. They were fighting with each other, and then A has committed the murder. The real fact is what? A has committed the murder. But another fact is what? A and B were quarreling before the murder. This is another fact which is related to the main fact. Such other facts are called res gestae. Statements, other facts, quarreling between A and B, which is part of some transaction in dispute, murder of B by A, can be admitted as evidence. The relevant facts can also be accepted as evidence. Admissions and confessions. This is the second exception. It can be proved through the evidence of a person to whom the admission or confession is made. There is a person to whom admission or confession is made. That person can come and tell to the court. This also we'll discuss in detail later. Statements in public documents. Contents of the public document can be proved by producing the document. Not necessary to bring the draftsman as a witness. Suppose there is a draftsman. Public documents means what? The documents which are prepared by public servants in their public duty while performing their official duties. Those are public documents. So if you want to prove the content of a public document, you just have to get the document. That's it. You did not bring the person who has drafted the public document. The fourth exception is what? Evidence in former proceedings. Evidence given by a witness in earlier proceeding can be used as evidence. Fifth exception. Statements of expert in treatise. Treatise means what? It is a written work of an expert. Opinions of experts expressed in treatise can be proved by producing such treatise. Whatever the opinion the experts give in their treatise, in their documents, in their books and all, if you want to prove it, just bring that book. That's it. Next question. How facts relating to conspiracy are relevant under Act? So what is conspiracy? Conspiracy first. Conspiracy means agreement between two or more persons. First, there is an agreement between two or more persons. An agreement is for what? To do an illegal act. The act itself is illegal. Like two persons A and B enter into an agreement to kill C. Killing of C itself is an illegal act. Or an act which is legal by illegal means. Example, A and B enter into an agreement to obtain export license. Obtaining export license is legal, but how are they obtaining? By fraud. So obtaining export license is legal, and but the means to obtain the export document is illegal. So conspiracy means what? It's an agreement between two or more persons to do an illegal act, crime, killing, or an act which is legal by illegal means, getting export license by fraud. Second point, each member is treated as a mutual agent. An act of one binds the other. If A does the act, A goes to the competent authority and gets the license under fraud, even B is liable, even B is deemed to be guilty, though he has not committed the offense in actual. Just because he is a party to an agreement, he is held liable. So each member is treated as a mutual agent. You are my agent, mutual agent. Agent means what? Principal agent. Act of the agent binds the principal. That's why mutual agent. Mutual agent means both are principal and agent of each other. If A does something, B is responsible. If B does something, A is responsible. Facts relevant to conspiracy. Anything said, done, or written by any member acts as an evidence against others, although it is done in their absence or without their knowledge, provided that such act is done in relation to the common intention. What is the common intention? Killing of C. Even if the other person, B, did not have the knowledge that A is going to kill C today, then also B is liable, because the act was related to the common intention. They knew that they had to kill C. It is irrelevant that whether B knew that A is going to kill C today itself or tomorrow. All that is irrelevant. The point is the act must be related to the common intention. Following conditions must be fulfilled to make a fact relevant to conspiracy. These conditions must be fulfilled. Then we can say that a fact is related to conspiracy. First condition, prima facie evidence that two or more persons have entered into conspiracy. The first evidence is what? The first condition is that by looking, prima facie means apparent. By looking at the situation itself, we can say that yes, two or more persons are involved in this crime. Once this is proved, anything said or done by any member binds the other also. Once you say that the two persons are involved in the crime, then that's more than enough. After that, both are mutual agents of each other. The third condition is that anything said or done must be related to common intention. The act done must be related to the common intention of killing B or getting the export license illegally. If any other act is done which is not related to the common intention, then it is not a condition of conspiracy. Such act must be done after formation of such common intention. First, agreement should be there, then they should form a common intention of what they're willing to do, and then act should be done, which is related to common intention. Once all the above conditions are satisfied, evidence of act can be accepted either to prove conspiracy or to show that a person was a party to the conspiracy. Question number 12. Cross-examination and scope of questions in cross-examination. By seeing cross-examination itself, we should remember cross-examination is done by the counterparty against the witness brought against him. In our example, B has brought witness E to support P. So A, the opposite lawyer, can cross-examine C. Cross-examination and scope of questions in cross-examination. Examination of a witness in court by his adverse party. A is examining C. A is the adverse party, witness is C. A is examining C. It's called cross-examination. Purpose is to find out how far witness speaks truth. It is very common that even we have seen in movies that witnesses are false. They come to the court and give some false statements. They are not trained by the lawyers properly. So the person who is cross-examining can easily make the witness speak the truth by asking him some random questions. So purpose is to find out how far the witness C speaks truth. It is both a sword of attack and shield of defense. Why sword of attack? It is sword of attack to B because B has brought a witness who is supporting B. So it is a sword of attack. It is B is attacking A, and it's shield of defense. A witness can be asked questions relating to facts and certain questions cannot be asked. A witness can be asked questions relating to facts. For the facts, you can ask him questions, but certain questions cannot be asked. In cross-examination, leading questions can also be asked. We have already discussed. Testing veracity of a witness means to find out his honesty and to ascertain to what extent witness is trustworthy. Veracity means you are judging whether a witness is speaking truth or not, and even if it is speaking something, to what extent we should rely on his words. 7th point. Court has powers to decide whether questions should be permitted or not, or witness should be compelled to answer or not. Example, question is not relevant but was asked to shake the witness. This is normally done. B has brought witness C to support him. So what A does, he poses some random questions to C to shock him. And in that anger, in that state of mind, there is a tendency that C might speak up the truth. So in these situations, court decides whether a question can be permitted to be asked, or if it is permitted, can the witness be compelled to answer it. If a witness refuses to answer, suppose a witness says, A has asked some random question to C to shake him, but C has refused to answer, then what? The court may infer that the answer, if given, would be adverse to the witness. Obviously, court will get a doubt. Then why he is not answering when he is trustworthy? 9th point, if court feels questions are groundless, it may refuse to permit such questions. If the counterparty A, adverse party A, asks some random questions which have no relevance to the case, then court may dismiss the questions. Question number 13, judicial notice and its importance under the Act. Sometimes court may accept certain facts as evidence without asking the parties to prove it. Great. Court is directly accepting the evidence without asking the parties to prove it. Normally, if a party has to give an evidence, first he has to prove it that the reasoning what he is giving is relevant to the fact, and then he is allowed to give the evidence for it. But in such cases, in some cases, court will directly take it as an evidence. This is due to the universal nature of the evidence. The evidence is of such universal nature that it is evident, it is apparent, it is prima facie that yes, this evidence we can accept. Judicial notice. Facts which the court will notice and accept as evidence, though it is not an evidence in real sense. Judicial notice means what? Court notices that this evidence, though actually not an evidence, can be accepted as an evidence. Court accepts the evidence without proof. The parties are relieved. Where the court decides to take judicial notice of facts, the parties are relieved as they are not required to prove it. Simple. Court cannot take all facts under judicial notice. All facts, only the universal facts can be taken under judicial notice. Facts regarding matters of public importance, history, literature, art, science, etc., can be taken as judicial notice. Question number 14, dying declaration and its relevance. Extremely important dying declaration. Meaning, when a person has knowledge of the facts, but for certain reasons like death, disability, etc., cannot be called before court. I have knowledge of the facts, I know what has happened, but somehow I cannot come to the court, and that reason may be I am dying, I am dead, or I am disabled from coming to the court. Such person's evidence can be taken through some other person. So such person, dying person, can give evidence to some other person. Example, imagine a movie scene here. A has shot B and ran. B's son comes and sees B. B, while dying, says, "Go, you know what happened? Son, you know what happened? A has shot me and I'm dying." So, in this example, B has knowledge of the facts, but he is dying, so he cannot go to the court and tell what has happened. In such cases, B can tell what has happened to C, and C can come to the court. Such person's B's evidence can be taken through some other person, that is C, his son. Dying declaration means that a person has recorded his statement when he was alive, but about the cause of his death. B was alive when he was shot, maybe for 5 minutes or 2 minutes, whatever it is, but he was alive. He has recorded the statement when he was alive. He has told C when he was alive what has happened. About the cause of his death or the circumstances causing his death. Who has killed him or the situations how he is dying. Now what are the essentials? Statement must be oral or in writing. Oral declaration can be by words or actions. Suppose he has shot him and he is not able to speak also. So by actions, B has communicated to C that A is the murderer. Or B tells C that A is the murderer. Or he cannot do both. B writes and says that A is the murderer. So oral evidence can be given by words or actions or in writing. Third point, person to whom declaration is made is immaterial. It is not relevant that the person should be a family member or somebody. The person dying declaration can be given to any person. The person can be magistrate or police officer or public servant or any ordinary person. Statement must relate to cause of his death or circumstances causing death. What should be the statement? How the death has happened or the circumstances under which his death has happened. In English law, British law, if a person makes a declaration without anticipation of his death, then it cannot be accepted, as it is based on the principle that the person on deathbed always speaks the truth. In British law, there is a concept that a person who is dying will always speak the truth. So if a person is giving a statement anticipating his death, A has shot B and B is anticipating that he will die soon. In such a situation, if B tells something to C or any other person, then it is presumed that a dying person cannot lie. So whatever B says is right and can be accepted as a dying declaration. In this regard, Indian law is different. As here, it is not required that the person should make the statement in anticipation of death. In Indian law, we are not saying that the person should feel that he is about to die and he should make a statement, then only the statement is relevant. English law says that he should anticipate that, then only the statement is relevant. Indian law says that he need not anticipate that, whatever he says will be relevant. Dying declaration is an exception to hearsay evidence. Why? In hearsay evidence is what? You are hearing and saying to the court. General rule is that it is not acceptable. But this is an exception. Why? C has heard it from B that A has shot B. So C has heard it first. Then C goes to the court and says it to the court that A has shot B. This is hearsay evidence. General rule, this words of C that A has killed B cannot be accepted, but this is an exception. So words of C are accepted here. Dying declaration is an exception to hearsay evidence, as the victim cannot come and give direct evidence. What is the evidentiary value? What is the value of the evidence? If after scrutiny, the court finds that the declaration is true, it can award conviction. If after listening to C and the court feels that yes, whatever C is saying is correct, it can declare that A is the culprit. But the value of such declaration is reduced if the declarant is alive. This is a very important point. See, the rule is that dying declaration, the word itself says the person is about to die and he gives a declaration. So dying declaration becomes very, very powerful when while dying B gives a declaration to C and B actually dies. The statement becomes very powerful. But B has given declaration to C while he is dying, but actually B is not dead. Then the statement becomes weak, because now that person can come and speak, no? So dying declaration must be complete to be reliable and relevant. The dying declaration must be complete also. Suppose B while dying just says that A and dies. It is not complete. C doesn't know that A has killed, or A has also seen the murder, or what? A what? So the dying declaration must be complete and reliable and relevant. Question number 15. Who is an accomplice and evidentiary value of accomplice evidence? Accomplice is not defined in the Act. Again, it is not defined in the Act. It means a partner in crime. You and I go and murder C. So you are my partner in crime and I am your partner in crime. So accomplice. A person who has taken part in committing an offence is a partner in crime, or we can even tell him as an accomplice. When a crime is done by more than one person, each one of them is an accomplice. Two to three people go and hit him and that person dies. All those 2 to 3 persons are accomplices of each other. All the evidence of accomplice is reliable, obviously, because one of the team member is going and saying that yes, we have committed the murder, so it is reliable. It is better to have it supported by another independent evidence. Why it is better to have it supported by another independent evidence? Because 2 to 3 people go and murder him. Whoever is the weakest person, the opposite lawyer can pull a weaker person and he can say that, don't worry, I will make sure that your punishment is not huge. You go and tell in the court that you have done the crime along with so and so people, and I will make sure that you are free. I'll make sure that I'll make you free. So see, you will feel that yes, you'll trust him, I'll get afraid, and he might go and accept it in the court. So although evidence of accomplice is reliable, but It is better to take opinion from an independent source also. What is approver's evidence? It is recorded on oath and is available for cross-examination. Approver's evidence is strong. Why? It is recorded on oath. Gita ki kasam kha ke वही कहता हूँ. It is like that. So it is recorded on oath and is available for cross-examination. That person is available for cross-examination also. Confession of co-accused. Sorry. Confession of co-accused, where the co-accused accepts the crime and also of his fellow accused, not recorded in oath and is not available for cross-examination. See, approver's evidence means what? Yes, the evidence is recorded on oath and the person is available for cross-examination also. So it is stronger evidence. Confession by co-accused means what? 2 to 3 people go and commit crime, murder XYZ person. One of the team members goes and accepts the crime and even says that yes, even they are with me and they are my teammates and all of us have committed the crime. So if co-accused means such person, a team member, he has made a confession, he has accepted the crime. So confession of co-accused, where the co-accused accepts the crime and also of his fellow accused. Co-accused cannot be, the evidence of the words of the co-accused are not taken on oath and that person is not available for cross-examination. So this is a weaker evidence. Examination. Therefore it is not a substantive evidence. Confession and kinds of confessions. What is a confession? I am accepting that this is my mistake. Is in confession. Simple. So not defined in the act again. So what is the meaning? It is a statement made by an accused in which he accepts that he has committed the offense. The accused accepts that yes, I am guilty, I have murdered B. A goes to the court and accepts that. A not goes to the court. A accepts that yes, I have murdered B. So this is confession. Confessions are of two types. Judicial confessions and extrajudicial confessions. What is judicial confession? Confessions made by an accused before a magistrate, because magistrate is a judicial person. Confession made by an accused A. Confession is what? Yes, A has murdered B. Before a magistrate, and such magistrate records the statement after he is satisfied that the accused has made the statement voluntarily. This is a very important point here. The accused should make the statement voluntarily. It is not that the accused had made the statement under force or under threat. We even see this in movies that A has murdered B, but what A does is that A is a powerful person or a political leader or something. Let us not mention it. He is a very powerful person. And A goes to his driver. A goes to his driver, suppose F, and says that you go to the magistrate and accept the crime and say that you have murdered B and I'll give you 1 crore rupees. So this is or A says that you go and accept the crime in front of B. Otherwise, if you don't accept, I will kill your family. So F gets afraid, and to protect his family or for the sake of 1 crore rupees, he goes to the magistrate and tells that yes, F has murdered B. So this statement has not been made voluntarily by him. So it is the duty of the magistrate to see that F makes a statement voluntarily. He should not make a statement under force or under threat. If it is made voluntarily, then he can record it and then it is treated as a confession, judicial confession. What is extrajudicial confession? Statement made by an accused outside the court. It is a statement made by an offender informally or casually to a person during friendly conversation. Suppose A has murdered B and Z is a friend of A. A casually during friendly talk he says that, do you know what happened last night? I murdered B. So A has given the statement very informally and casually during friendly conversation with Z. Such person can be relative, friend. We are talking about Z. Z can be relative or friend or neighbor or any person, but he shouldn't be a magistrate. The name itself says judicial confession means the accused goes to the judicial officer and accepts his guilt. Judicial officer we mean magistrate. Extrajudicial confession, the name itself says that the accused goes outside the judicial officers and makes confession to friends or any other person except magistrate or judicial officers. So what is the difference between judicial confession and extrajudicial confession? Judicial confession made before magistrate, and this is made before any person. Judicial confession, magistrate ensures that it is voluntary without pressure. Extrajudicial confession, the person who listens to it does not ensure that it is made voluntarily or not. Judicial confession, if properly recorded, has a greater value. If magistrate first ensures that the person accused is giving the statement voluntarily and properly records it, then it is of a very great value. Extrajudicial confession, Z should listen to the statements with extra caution. I mean, when Z goes to the court and says, court should listen to Z with extra caution, because it is coming from an informal source. If it is court, see, suppose imagine court is getting evidence from a judicial person. Obviously that evidence will be more reliable to it. And if a court is getting information from some random person, that information won't be too reliable to the court. So that's why it should be cautious. Question number 17. In what circumstances confession is relevant? When can we say that a confession is relevant? Certain confessions are not admissible. Certain confessions are not allowed as evidence. Confessions made by an accused who is not free because of threat. In our example, Mr. F. F was threatened by A, if you don't go and admit your offense, I will kill your family. So, it is not free. Such confessions are not acceptable. Tell truth, otherwise I will inform the police. Tell the truth, or go and tell that you have committed the crime, otherwise I will kill your family. Even if the court gets a small doubt that the confession is not free, it won't accept it. Because this is a very important point. If this is the case, court will give a lot of wrong judgments. So the court tries to be 100% sure that the person who is making the confession is voluntarily making the confession and is speaking the truth. Then only the court accepts it. If it gets a slightest doubt, then it won't accept it. The pressure must create an advantage in the mind of the accused that by making a confession he will gain some advantage. In our example, A says to F that if you go and accept the crime which I have done, I'll give you 1 crore rupees. So it is creating an advantage in the mind of the accused. It is creating an advantage in the minds of F. Or to avoid some unpleasant evil, killing of F's family. Fourth point, confessions made to police officer are not accepted as evidence. Generally, the confessions made to police officers are not accepted as evidence, but some points say that the confessions made to police officers are accepted as evidence. Why it is not accepted as evidence? Because generally what we feel that the police officers are very strict. So the person who is making the confession might be in threat that if I tell anything wrong or if I don't accept what the police is saying, the police might torture me or hit me. So as a general rule, the confessions made to the police officer are not accepted. But if confession is made at the threat of the police torture, it is not acceptable, and this is quite common. After murder, accused made confession in writing and kept the letter beside the dead body for police to see. It is acceptable. Confessions made to the police officer is not acceptable as evidence. Confession made to a police officer in the presence of a magistrate is acceptable as evidence, as the presence of magistrate rules out the possibility of police torture. Suppose, imagine a situation that a person accused A after killing B goes to police officer. Police officer calls the magistrate also, and A confesses his crime that yes, I have killed B. Normally what we say that when A goes to police officer and says that yes, I have killed B, it is not accepted as confession. But in this case, A has accepted the crime in the presence of the magistrate and the police officer. Then it is accepted as confession, because the presence of magistrate makes it sure that A is not tortured by the police. Question number 18. When confession leading to discovery of a fact is relevant under the Act. Confession relating to discovery of a fact. When can we say that the confession relating to the discovery of fact is relevant? Two exceptions when confessions made to police officers are acceptable. When can we say that the confession made to the police officer are acceptable? There are two conditions. First, the presence of magistrate. We have already told about this. Or both the conditions may not be satisfied. Any one of the conditions satisfied, it's more than enough. Or statement is made to a police and police receives some additional material proving the statement. Such discovery of fact makes this statement reliable. What is our question? When confession leading to a discovery of a fact is relevant, discovery of an additional fact, that's what it is covered in this point. So general rule is that confession made to a police officer is not acceptable, but it can be accepted when magistrate is present, or statement is made to police officer without the presence of magistrate, and later police get some additional evidence, additional matter which is relating to the statement. Then the confession becomes acceptable. Example, accused tells the police that he has killed Mr. B. This is very interesting, listen to it. Accused tells the police that he has killed B. A tells the police that he has killed B and kept the knife in the drawer. A goes along with the police and police finds the knife in the drawer. Even then, the statement is relevant only to the extent that the accused has led to the discovery of the weapon. The statement that the accused has murdered Mr. B is still not proved. See the extent of protection that a person who is making confession before the police gets. Even if he is going and saying that yes, I have killed, and police is getting additional information that yes, the police has found the pistol or gun or knife in the drawer where the accused is saying, even then it is proved only to the fact that yes, the accuser taken us to the weapon through which murder was happened. So there are two facts now. First fact is what? The accused is saying that the gun is in the drawer. Second fact is what? And with the gun I have killed Mr. B. And accused takes the police to the drawer and police finds the gun there. So even then only the first statement is proved, it seems. The second statement is not proved that A has committed the murder. Question number 19, confession by co-accused. When two or more persons commit an offence and one of the co-accused accepts that he has committed the crime along with his fellow co-accused. Essentials. If following conditions are satisfied, the confession of co-accused is also applicable to other co-accused. If these conditions are satisfied, whatever the confession the co-accused is making is applicable to other his teammates also. What is the first condition? Two or more persons commit the same offence. A, B, C, D commit the offence of killing X. The two or more persons commit the same offence. Confession by him that he is guilty and his fellow co-accused are also guilty. A goes and says that yes, I am guilty, I have committed the crime, and even my friends B, C, D and E have also helped me in committing the crime. Example, A and B are charged of murder of C. B accepts and says yes, even A was involved. Then if the confession is true, even A will be punished. What is the evidentiary value of a co-accused? What is the value of it? Statement of the co-accused is not a substantive evidence. We cannot come to a conclusion with the statement. Only a corroborative, that is supportive evidence. Thus, when there is no other evidence, conviction just on the basis of confession made by co-accused is illegal. Very important point. Even if, what is the general rule? The statement of the co-accused is not a conclusive evidence or a substantive evidence. We need other supporting evidence also to support his statement. Suppose a situation is there where only the statement of the co-accused is present before court. No other evidence is present before court. Even then the court cannot say that yes, he is saying right and give the judgment. If the court gives the judgment on the basis of the statement of the co-accused, the judgment is illegal. Fourth point, it is a weaker evidence than the evidence of an approver. Why? Because in approver's case, the evidence is given on oath and approver is available for cross-examination. Because approver takes oath and can even be cross-examined. Question number 20, retracted confession. Accused has made the confession but later denies the fact itself that he has made the confession. A went and accepted his crime before the magistrate. Later he denies it completely that no, not at all, I have not gone to the magistrate at all. Retracted, the meaning itself, the word itself says retracted. I retracted from my own words. I reverted, I changed my own words. Once retractment happens, retraction makes the court very cautious that the confession is made voluntarily. Because once a person who has accepted his crime before a magistrate or some other person, and later after coming to the court changes his opinion, it obviously gives a doubt to the court whether the confession is given voluntarily or not. Because obviously if the confession is given voluntarily, why will he change his opinion? He is changing the opinion, that itself means that the confession is not voluntary. That's why retraction makes the court very cautious that the confession is made voluntarily. Credibility of retracted confession depends on the facts and circumstances. Now, after the confession becomes retracted confession. Retracted confession means what? Earlier I have accepted, later I have denied. So the confession becomes retracted confession. So whether to accept the retracted confession that yes, no, I have not committed the crime, it depends on the facts and circumstances of the case. In a case, Supreme Court has maintained that retracted confession may form the basis of conviction if the court is satisfied that it was true and voluntarily made. Even after creating a doubt on the court that retracted confession is not voluntary, even then the court will accept as a basis to give conviction if it is found that it is made voluntarily and it is true. Question number 21, impeaching the trait of a witness. A case cannot be proved against a person on the basis of his character. Just by proving about a person's character, you cannot win the case. You cannot prove that what you are saying is correct. But another rule is what? Another rule says that evidence can be given with regard to a person's character and he can even be cross-examined on this. Purpose of proving the character of a person or a witness is to attack and establish that he is an unreliable witness. Why are we proving the character of the person? Suppose Mr. B has brought witness C to support him, and A during his cross-examination proves that C is not a reliable person. What he says something nonsense, something rubbish. We cannot rely on him. Then whatever C says in support of B is also questioned by the court. It becomes an unreliable witness. Impeaching the credit of a witness means exposing the real character of the witness to the court. Telling the court, showing the court that the real character of Mr. C is impeaching the credit of a witness. That the court may not act on the evidence given by such witness. So by A proving that C is not a trustworthy person, indirectly tells the court that you please don't listen to this person or take his words as an evidence, because the person is a false person, he's a cheater, he's a liar. Credit of a witness can be impeached by any of the following ways. Now, how to impeach the credit of a witness? By proving witness is unworthy of credit, where the witness has been bribed or accepted the offer of bribe for giving evidence in favor of any person. Suppose, as we said, Mr. B has brought Mr. C as his witness. So, how C is coming to the court and supporting B? The reason behind this is that B has given a lot of money to C to support him, or he has not given, he has just made an offer and C has accepted the bribe. Even then, by proving this, he can prove this, that this has happened. By proving this, the credibility of the witness is questioned. When a person makes inconsistent statements while giving evidence, his credit may be impeached, obviously. Today you are saying something, tomorrow you are saying something, or now you are saying something, after 5 minutes you are saying something. So this means that you are not sure of what you are saying. If a person is speaking the truth, he will say the same sentence again even in his sleep. You are changing his sentences in just a matter of 2 to 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 1 hour. This means that you are not speaking the truth. So when a person makes inconsistent statements while giving evidence, his credibility may be impeached. Question number 22, the last question, refreshing memory. The best part about law is that the question itself will give you the answer. See the question, refreshing memory. Refreshing memory means what? Revising. When a witness comes to the court and he feels that, yes, I want to refer the statements that I have given, the documents, so that I recollect what has happened, so that I recollect the facts. So the witness is given the documents. By this, the witness refreshes his memory of the facts. That's very simple. Witness can refresh his memory by consulting the written statements made by him. Witness is permitted for referring to documents or papers or letters in order to recollect the facts. Witness can refer the papers to recollect the facts, to refresh his memories. He can even refer to the writings made by another person. Witness can seek court's permission for referring to any document, and if court is satisfied that there is proper reason, it may grant permission. Suppose a witness wants to refer some document, so he should request the court that please I want to refer that document, and the court, if permits, if found reasonable that there is a proper reason, court may permit, yes, you may refer the document. Fifth point, experts as witness are permitted to refer their professional books. Sixth point, police officers can refresh their memory by referring to the statements recorded by them in FIR. Magistrate who records confessional statement can refer it. When a person refers any document for refreshing his memory, the adverse party can demand the said document to be shown to him so that he may cross-examine. Witness is asking some document to be shown to him so that his memory is refreshed. So the opposite lawyer can even demand, please show the document to me also, so that I can cross-examine the witness on the basis of that document. the witness about the document. That's it. So that's it, guys. The third part of the video of law of evidence, that is the Indian Evidence Act 1872, is completed. Thank you. Please like or subscribe to the video. Thank you.